Hello, this is David Bernstein. I am President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this webinar. JCPA is the network hub of 125 Jewish community relations councils at the local level and 16 national organizations. We work on public policy concerns and fight anti-Semitism and bigotry, working with other ethnic and religious communities to see change in the larger society. We also follow very closely what's going on in the Middle East, and we are very delighted to have with us Mara Rudman, who is a Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. She also spent years in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration working on Middle East policy. She's very experienced. We know firsthand she's very knowledgeable because we've had her before. Mara, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So I'm going to ask viewers, if you would like to ask a question, please do so in the question box, and we will check out the question box and ask some questions tomorrow as well. So, Mara, we have a new administration. That new administration has many of the same policy hands that it had in the Obama administration. How do you think that this new administration is going to see the Middle East, and what challenges might confront it?
Sure, David. Well, I would say that what stands out to me about all of the appointees to this administration is their experience, their practical ability to hit the ground running on day one, which I think was, as far as I can tell, a primary objective for President Biden. And so in that context, yes, there are certainly people who have had extensive experience in prior administrations, but also just have a clear focus on what needs to be done. I would say, first of all, in looking at the Middle East, I look at the Middle East, I believe this administration is looking at the Middle East through a global prism that includes domestic issues. President Biden has repeatedly talked about we need to be strong at home to be strong in the world, and vice versa. So that it puts a big premium on strategic partnerships, on working with allies, working with others who have shared interests and are grappling with some of the same challenges, the pandemic and pandemic response, front and center among those, as is climate. And it also means figuring out how to work together to deal with some of our most significant competitors, and that's how the president has referred to China, for example. And so I think the Middle East needs to be viewed in that context. That to me does not mean walking away from by any means, but it means looking at how we approach each country in the region and what is happening in the region through the prism of what we frankly need at home here in the United States, what we need to be stronger in the world, and what we need to be able to deal with very significant competitors like China and Russia in a different context. So that's how I would broadly frame it.
Mm-hmm. So the previous administration had approached the Middle East peace process in a very different way. We've heard it referred to as outside in. It was able to see through deals between Israel and two Gulf states and also Sudan. The Abraham Accords, known for both the ties between Bahrain and the UAE. Do you believe that the Biden administration will follow suit on this sort of outside-in approach to diplomacy in the Middle East?
Well, first, I want to differ with you slightly on your characterization at the front end. Not that I see the outside-in component. Where I differ from you is that this is a significant change from prior administrations. I think so often, whether Democrat or Republican, each administration builds on what its predecessors have done in a variety of ways. I think it may be harder in some ways to see that with President Trump and his administration for a variety of reasons. But in this particular context, the concept of working with various partners in the Middle East to also help to affect the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic was part and parcel of a variety of things. And I know I myself was involved in with President Obama, and that President Bush, George W. Bush, was involved in with his administration. I've had some of those conversations with folks who worked for his administration. So even the some of the specifics of the UAE agreement, for example, were quite familiar to me because they had been part of prior discussions with the Emirates, as well as several of the other countries that have followed suit. So to me, it's not a fresh new thing, it's building on prior. And I would also note that for the kind of agreement that triggered the Abraham Accords, which was with the Emirates, that was directly related to Palestinian issues. I understand the Palestinians were not happy with the agreement, but the link to getting a commitment from Israel not to go forward with annexation, which I believe was the topic I was last on a webinar with you folks on with Robert Satloff, and we both felt so strongly that Israel's threat to move forward on annexation was a significant, it's an understatement to say a significant challenge. And for folks, June, July seems like much longer ago than it was. So it may be easy to forget that the basis for the UAE agreement was a commitment not to proceed by Israel, not to proceed with annexation. And that the Emirati ambassador, Yusuf Al-Attaba, had put a quite significant opinion piece in, I think it was in Haaretz. It may have been in another Israeli paper shortly before about the dangers of annexation and how the Emirates viewed it. So that's a long way of saying this is a continued approach. I think that President Biden has already laid out when he was a candidate in the same time frame that the agreements were announced, how positive he thought they were, why he thought they were positive. His predecessors, including President Clinton, who I served for, put out similar statements about it. So I think it shows the continuity. And I think it will also be continuity in terms of my expectation that this administration would look to further build on those accords and those agreements, both for the importance of how we work in the region and also to try to better the situation on the ground for Palestinians as well as Israelis, to get back to a place where we could get to some agreement between them.
I'm going to push back also just a little bit and get your response. So Secretary of State John Kerry, during his time, said very, very specifically that you would never be able to see progress with the Arab countries until you saw a Palestinian deal, and that turned out not to be the case. Do you think that was sort of a guiding policy of the administration, or was that sort of an observation that he was making about the Middle East?
So I didn't work for Secretary Kerry. I can't really speak to that time or be able to describe whether it was a statement versus administration policy. I guess I would be surprised about it as administration policy per se, because the goal consistently in President Obama's first term, which is what I'm speaking to, and knowing exactly what was out there in terms of what we were trying to get work with countries in the region to do, was consistent with trying to make progress on the ground and make progress in various ways. So that the Emirati agreement, to me, as for reasons I described, is entirely consistent with looking to make progress on the ground. I also think it's in a variety of ways, both in stopping something bad, annexation, and in putting out the opportunity for more positive things to happen in terms of various investment opportunities, work going forward with the Palestinians. So I don't see the action that was taken in terms of Abraham Accords as inconsistent with Secretary Kerry's position statement that you read, and I also think it's too narrow a reading of the statement to assume that any administration would have the policy of nothing should happen until there's a final deal. That, of course, has been Saudi Arabia's position in putting forward the Arab initiative in some senses, that it was a little bit of an all or nothing. But if you work in this region or anywhere in foreign policy, or maybe it's my legal training, using always and never is generally a mistake.
Got it. So we obviously saw these deals signed at the sort of twilight of the Trump administration in September on the White House lawn. Why did the Arab countries eventually agree to drop that demand? What brought them to the table? You'd mentioned annexation, which I thought is interesting because it would suggest that a right-wing government can create leverage by doing things that might be inimical to the peace process. But what else might be at work?
So I think just to go to your last point first, I think that there's always a challenge with any extremists in any country, among any group, to try to leverage worse behavior for getting change. I think that's something that various diplomatic efforts should work against. I don't think we ever should have gotten to the point with Israel where annexation was as real a threat as it was. And I would put that on a failure of diplomacy and a failure of how we engaged. But then you work with the facts on the ground and figure out what your options are to deal with it. And that's the category in which I would put the entrance into Abraham Accords. In terms of what's different, again, it's a continuum over time. When I traveled with George Mitchell around the region in his early days as Special Middle East Peace Envoy, he remarked very clearly on the significant change over what was, I think, then approximately a 10-year period from when he had made that kind of travel previously for President Clinton and then President Bush, about how stark the Iranian threat was and how that was the first topic of discussion. And so there was a recalibration on the, I would say in his work in those early days on how to deal with the region in the context and the costs and the opportunities posed by the fact that you could see the beginnings of different regional alliances as a result of the concern about Iran's behavior. So I would say that has only further accelerated in terms of seeing shifts in configurations in the region. Iran's actions and behaviors and concerns about the threat Iran poses, and then in a different context, Turkey as well. And then there have been various, I don't mean to trivialize by saying neighborhood skirmishes, but there have been various other dynamics between and among various countries in the region that have also shifted the playing field, and that would be expected. That's part of what happens over time.
Right. Another reason that I've heard, of course, is that that the administration sort of sweetened the pot for those countries. In the case of the UAE, there was an arms deal that went along with it. Since that time, the Biden administration seems to have put that on hold. Do you know why that might be the case? And that comes from one of the callers, by the way, one of the viewers who posted that question.
Yeah, I don't know that they put it on hold. I think there's a normal process that you're meant to follow. It's, frankly, easy to forget about that given how the last administration operated on a host of fronts. But something like arms sales actually goes through an extensive executive branch review process and then a consultation with the Hill. And then depending on what it is and what's involved, I think generally the consultations with the Hill can also involve some votes. And I'm not well versed enough in the specific details here to know whether we're in a voting situation with the Hill or not. But I think what they've done is apply regular process.
There's a lot that's been also said about the Arab countries being interested in Israel as a technology superpower in the region, a regional power. And do you see that as a driving factor as well? Or do you see this mostly as sort of responding to the threat of Iran?
I think there are, I think there are a number of economic opportunities for a number of players in the region. Israel is certainly impressive on technology. I would not undersell the Emiratis on that score, and a number of and other countries in the region that have invested heavily as well. So I don't know that it's as one-sided as that statement would suggest, as opposed to kind of multiple opportunities. I will say, though, this is also an area of significant interest and concern for the United States, because whenever you start talking about how technology is used and who's using it in which ways, you can bet that we have challenges with China. And China is working quite intently to to infiltrate the region in various ways, and I use that word purposefully. Maybe in a commercial sense, but it's in a way that poses some significant security threats as well. Certainly to the United States, and I would argue to a number of players in the region. And so how we look at technology cooperation and what it means is a critical issue for the United States that goes back to some of the global context and concern. Definitely, obviously, want to maximize what can be done in terms of technology, but need to do it in a smart way that has a clear eye about where our competitors and our threats are. And I don't mean just economic competitors in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So the development of the Abraham Accords and the other peace deals was not good news for the Palestinian Authority. It certainly wasn't greeted that way. They generally condemned the agreements, and obviously they saw it perhaps for what it was, which was a weakening of their own position within the Middle East and within global diplomacy. What do you think their next move is here? Do you think at some point, as some suggest, that if enough outside in takes place, if enough Arab countries cut a deal, if Saudi Arabia's next or not in too far distant future, that eventually the Palestinians will say, okay, we've got to start really negotiating?
So first, I would differ with you on whether I would want to distinguish between the 2 points you just made, which is whether something is good for the Palestinian Authority and what the public position of the Palestinian Authority was. So I agree with you that their public position was quite negative, and I think it's not the first time that they have positioned themselves in a way that is not necessarily beneficial to them. I don't think, though, that the underlying question is about when the Palestinians are ready to start negotiating. I think the bigger question is how we can get both parties, the Palestinians and the Israelis, to a place where they can talk with one another more effectively about possible outcomes. And I think that's in Israel's interest as much as it's in the Palestinians' interest. And so where are the levers to increase the opportunities to get to a place, which I think there's pretty wide agreement that they are very far apart right now from being able to have effective negotiations with one another. But what can we, the United States, do? What can other countries in the region do? What can we do with some of our allies in other parts of the world to encourage and to encourage the ability for Israelis and Palestinians to come to lasting and sustainable agreements with each other? And I would assert that Israelis have a lot of work to do in that regard, and Palestinians have a lot of work to do in that regard. And I would also assert, though, that it continues to be in the interests of the United States, of other players in the region, and of players elsewhere, as well as Israelis and Palestinians, to get them closer to the ability to negotiate and not have the opportunity for example, two-state solution disappear entirely from the horizon, and we are perilously close to that.
So our friend David Makovsky from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, someone I'm sure you know well and we know well, likes to say that one of the mistakes he thought previous administrations had made was going for the home run when they really should have gone for the single. He loves baseball analogies, and you know, do you A, agree, and B, do you think that this administration might try to take a different approach in that way and say we're not going to be able to cut a two-state solution deal, at least not right away, and we're going to have to do this more incrementally, and that means trying to get the parties to take certain steps far short of that grand gesture?
So first, I would say, in full disclosure, Dave Makovsky and I, in the small world that is this work, go so far back that his wife, long before she was his wife, was my roommate in Jerusalem when I was first there for 3 months doing some work and study. So I go way back with David and with Varda. I would characterize this way, that it is critically important to be able to show real changes on the ground for people from whom you want more significant commitments and where you want to build the ability for people to work together. But for the politics of this situation, I think it's important that it happen in a way that people see a political horizon. That if you're having a bunch of singles, but you don't know the game is 9 innings, and you don't trust the umpires, and a bunch of other scenarios in the baseball analogy, your singles are not going to get you where you want to go. So you have to have a picture of the entire ball field. You have to have a sense of where you're going, which to me is not the same thing as putting deals on the table. I think the kind of big talk needs to significantly come down, and we need to be able to show, and I'm talking about all members of the international community, be able to show and act in ways that indicate that we are serious about seeing change on the ground, in having Palestinians and Israelis alike feel more secure and be secure in their interactions with one another. Being able to show that you have running water going into your house, and you have infrastructure that works for you. If you're in Gaza and frankly parts of the southern West Bank where that's a significant challenge, and regular electricity, and the opportunity for jobs in a future that are better for your children than they've been for you. And there are things that we have done and that we can do, and do smartly and strategically to get to those ends and get to a place where we have better ground for working together. But that needs to be within the framework of showing that the game has 9 innings and we know where we are, and we're trying to get to a final outcome where, frankly, and again, this is where the baseball analogy falls apart, because you don't want to have a winner and a loser. You want to have a win-win situation in the final outcome. And so it should all be structured in how you get there. And I think at various points, various administrations, both Democratic and Republican in the United States, have been better or worse about doing that, and making the connections between what is really important on the ground and how that can affect people's mindset, disposition, and political ability to negotiate.
So do you have any thoughts on what we might see next? I know that's always predicting anything is never easy, but in the Middle East it might even be more fraught. But any ideas of whether we're likely to see a deal with Saudi Arabia in the not too distant future? Any ideas if we're going to see some bold moves on the Palestinian front? What do you see in your crystal ball?
So I think some items are easier to predict than others, based on statements that that President Biden made as a candidate, and areas that it's clear he is passionate about and kind of convinced of the interests of the United States. And I think there are other areas it's going to take longer to feel out. So in the first bucket, I would put, and I think it's consistent with what I said before about being able to show and have the leverage of the United States to offer tangible differences on the ground, that we need to restore our assistance to the Palestinians and the ability to move forward with greater ease on that front. Assistance under President Trump was down to $10 million a year in bilateral assistance, and all of our multilateral assistance was cut off. And that was coming out of, at various points in the previous 12 years, the Obama administration, and certainly I'm familiar with the last 4 years, I can't speak to the first 4 years of the Bush administration, that number was anywhere between 300 to 500 million for bilateral aid, and then an additional 300 or 400 million in multilateral aid to UN entities and the like. And so getting to the point where we actually can get back to I'm not saying necessarily those numbers, but some ability to offer help on the ground, which I want to be clear is also help that Israel has felt is very important at various points in terms of what we can do in the West Bank, what we can do in Gaza, what we can help Palestinians do and achieve. That's a critical point. Being able to have places in the United States where you can talk to the Palestinians in terms of the importance of diplomacy. And so reinstating in some way the office or the facility that's available for Palestinians to be able to operate here in the United States, I believe would be another thing that we're likely to see, again, for the tools of diplomacy to increase opportunities. I think that how we deal with Saudi Arabia is complicated. So there may be opportunities, certainly in terms of the Abraham Accords, but there's a lot of other elements at play with the Saudis, as the administration's announcement about weapon sale, offensive weapon sales that involve their actions in Yemen are evidence of. And so it's still it remains a very important relationship for the United States. Clearly, the Saudis are critical players in the region, but I think there's some recalibration there. And I wouldn't be surprised if how they interact with Israel and where the opportunities are in terms of Abraham Accord-like agreements are in that mix of opportunities in the recalibration of the relationship. But I wouldn't try to put a timeline on that.
Okay. I've gotten several questions about this that suggest that President Biden has yet to pick up the phone and call Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you know anything about that?
No, I only know from, again, my historical experience. I happened to be in President Obama's administration and at the White House for the first 4 months of the administration before I went to do the Middle East work with Senator Mitchell. And so I have a very direct feel for what the first few weeks of administration is like, and the various ways that how many different causes you have to manage in how many ways. And I don't believe that, I think this is the case, I'm going to double check my facts, but I don't believe that there has been a priority put on outreach to Middle East leaders per se right now. I think that the president has been very clear that his first, second, third, fourth focus is pandemic response and recovery for the United States and for what that means globally. And he has put, again, at a very high level, the pandemic and climate-related issues. And I would expect that most, if not all, of the international calls he has had relate to that in one way or another. And I would say that one exception that comes to mind is with President Putin, and that was very clearly because there was an arms agreement that was going to run out, and there needed to be a conversation about how we were going to handle that. And in the course of that conversation, he also brought up the treatment of the dissident who has been jailed there and now sentenced. So I think with that kind of exception, and for those reasons, it's clear where the priorities are. And I would read into that only what is consistent with what the president has said about his priorities.
So I've gotten a few questions on the administration's attitude, likely attitude toward Israeli settlements. And I think I'm going to try to riff on it a bit. I think it was 2004, the Bush administration sent a letter that was negotiated with the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, that suggested that that settlements built within the security fence would not be considered problematic, and that Israel would then suspend building outside the security fence. And we saw that change a bit under the Obama administration. I'm not sure that line was shared by the Obama administration at the time. I think probably it was restored under the last administration. Do you believe that this administration is likely to make that distinction in policy?
So I am very well aware of the letter that you're referencing, not only from my time in President Obama's administration, but also from extended discussions with Elliot Abrams and others who worked on that letter. I wouldn't characterize it in precisely the way that you have, in terms of what the interpretations of it are and have been, but I don't want to get Talmudic about it on this call. But it's an important letter. It was an interesting approach by the Bush administration. I don't think that I would not say that the Trump administration then followed that letter, because they were in fact they were not terribly concerned about where Israel.
Right, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. I appreciate that. Yeah.
And so I think the question of how to address settlements will be one for this administration, I would expect that they would say that they would recognize reality, which is that settlement construction is an obstacle to peace and to getting to negotiations between the parties. And certainly anyone who has traveled extensively in the West Bank can see the reality of what it means to be Palestinian and just move around and where you can move and how with what has been quite significant development and expansion of settlements throughout the West Bank over past generations. So the position that settlements are an obstacle to negotiations is not new. The Trump administration was clearly an exception on making that point, but every other prior Democratic and Republican administration has said that and seen it that way. And I would expect that that would also be the case with this administration.
We got some questions about the status of the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas is not getting any younger, but we've been saying that for years, by the way. He's a chain smoker. We've been saying that for years as well. You know, he's in, I think it's, some people like to say the 12th year of a 5-year term or something like that. What do you think is next for the Palestinian Authority? And what do you think the U.S. and Israel should do to make sure that it doesn't crumble, or it doesn't, and that we continue to preserve the kind of security cooperation that we see right now?
So I think there are a couple different questions embedded in that. The question of what's the next generation, who or what is the next generation of leadership, and what the transition mechanisms are to that is an important one. I will say I don't have good answers. I believe that we could do more to encourage, first to recognize the talents and strengths that President Abbas brought to the table, the dangers of a next generation not having some of those talents and strengths, and the role, where the role is or isn't for outside parties to help to encourage that from the next generation of leadership. And I would put in the bucket of those talents and strengths, recognizing Israel and being committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, and being clear and taking issue with those in the Palestinian community and in the broader Arab world at various points that did not share those views. It can get a lot worse than that, and I think people should be mindful of that, and I think too often they have not been mindful of that. In terms of what are the tangible things that we as the United States, I don't want to speak for Israel, obviously, could be doing, should be doing, that harkens back to my prior point. We need to have, we as the United States need to have and exercise the ability to make life better, to look with an eye towards who are the strategic thinkers and leaders who say and do and are acting that way on the Palestinian side. And again, I'll give an example from my prior experience. I worked very closely with Prime Minister Fayyad when he was in the Prime Minister's role, and both when I was at the State Department and when I was the Assistant Administrator at USAID, because he had a clear sense of what kinds of assistance was going to be most useful, in which ways to make a real difference in people's lives. And I will say he also understood that that would help the bigger objectives, the big picture objectives as well. But you might wonder why I mentioned water and sanitation earlier. That was almost 50% of the US bilateral economic budget. And it allowed the difference of having people in towns and villages have water coming in on a regular basis and the impact that has on the rest of your life, the rest of your daily life, and the combination of the water and electricity coming in, and frankly, having that accrue to a governance structure that is working for you, a local governance structure, a national governance structure in the sense of the Prime Minister reported to the President, but was Prime Minister carrying out those things. And so I think the United States has at times been very effective working with Europeans and others in maximizing those opportunities, and at times has been less effective, taking our eyes off the ball in a sense, because the details can be boring to people and not everyone kind of connects the dots on why it matters.
We've gotten several questions about the United Nations and other international institutions. Israel's always had a tense relationship with the UN, with other related United Nations institutions. Recently, we saw the ruling from the International Criminal Court, which has really severe implications for Israel. The UN Human Rights Council continues to really be one-sided toward Israel. And then, of course, we have the UN and the UN Security Council itself. We know that at the very end of the Obama administration, there was some tension between the Obama administration and some in the pro-Israel community over the Obama administration's decision not to veto a UN Security Council resolution on settlements. What do you think the Biden administration's attitude is going to be about the UN and other related institutions, about their stance on Israel?
So I would again put us back in the bigger frame. And I know it's the United States operates, and I say this again from my prior government hat. So when I use we, I'm more talking in that context, not that I know anything about the inner operations of this administration. But the United States generally, when you're doing your job, when we're doing our job on the national security front, we are looking out for our own interests, as crass as that may be, and what helps the United States best in the world. And a number of those things come to the win-win outcomes because they also help other players in the world. So the UN is a critical body for U.S. interests, for international interests in various settings. And so I would fully expect the Biden administration, as they're talking about renewing diplomacy and renewing what is possible and rebuilding what is possible through multilateral mechanisms as well as bilateral, since you're always better off in any circumstance, not just in international politics, when you have more people with you versus when you go it alone. And so I would view the approach to the UN, to NATO, to various alliances in that context. How can we make these entities work better together? I would fully expect, and from everything President Biden has said, that also includes making sure that Israel is treated fairly within those forums, is not unduly singled out. But I will say, just by way of example, the president, I believe just in the last couple of days, has indicated the United States will rejoin the Human Rights Forum. And that, I believe, is a view that's consistent with the view that it's better when we're in the room than when you're outside of the room, in terms of what we can do for a variety of different players and actors, and in carrying out what are U.S. interests and values.
Great. So I thought we'd spend a little time on Iran. The Obama administration cut the Iran deal, JCPOA. The Trump administration withdrew from the Iran deal. The Biden administration has indicated that it will try to rejoin the JCPOA or do something with Iran that certainly brings the United States back into relationship. What is your thinking on where that's going? And what has the administration said it would do? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, because I guess my face may have expressed, again, I think I would differ in the characterization, because what I have heard the administration say they are going to do, and the way that I have heard President Biden articulate the interests or concerns, is finding ways to deal with and address the very significant nuclear threat that Iran poses, and figuring out the best route for that, at the same time that we, the United States, would be looking to also address the significant regional threat that Iran has posed by its activities, that is separate and in addition to the nuclear threat that they pose, and also deal with issues like their development on ballistic missiles. So this administration has been very clear in saying all of those tracks are critically important, and they are currently undergoing an assessment on the degree of Iran's compliance or non-compliance, I should say more accurately, with the previous agreement that now neither the United States nor Iran is part of. And I would fully expect that assessment would include what will it take to get Iran back into compliance, to then be able to move further to the kind of agreement that the United States would be comfortable with.
Great. So, well, I think we've really hit on some of the big issues that are going to be facing this new administration, facing Israel. Is there any advice that you might have for the American Jewish community, the mainstream organizations like ours, and how we might navigate these times? What might be our posture vis-a-vis the Biden administration in trying to make sure, on the one hand, we look out for Israel, which we do, and on the other hand, we look out for peace, which we do?
So I think first, you're working with friends. You're working with people who have, I very much believe, shared interests and shared values. And I would keep that mindset first and foremost. And I think you're working with a number of people who are problem solvers. And one question, does everyone in the administration define or describe the scope of the problem in the same way that you or your members might? Maybe not, but there's probably a fair amount of common ground. So figuring out how it's most effective for you to lay out what your concerns are, to recognize that sometimes I found in problem solving, increasing the aperture, the size of the scope of what you're considering part of the problem set can also increase your solution set. And I would frankly look at the Abraham Accords in that context. And what gives you more opportunities. And I think that kind of pragmatic approach, the figurative rolling up your shirt sleeves and sitting down to talk through where options are, would be an approach that everyone I know on this team would be very receptive to.
Great, thank you. Mara, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate the depth you went into on these various questions. I think it's a lot of food for thought. And we're going to have a second talk with Bret Stephens, the Pulitzer Prize winning columnist in the New York Times, who was also a keen commentator on the Middle East, slightly different perspective, I would imagine, than you have on some of these questions. And it will be at 1 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. If you have not registered, please do so, because we are very close to maxing out. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon. Be well.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Just one quick point, as people I hope think about when they're listening to the discussion tomorrow. It's very different to have been in the arena than to be commenting on the arena. And so again, regardless of people's ideological views, you come away a little grittier when you've been in the arena.
Well, we've got some tough questions for Bret as well, so we'll put them to the test.
Great.
Thanks.
Well, thanks.
Take care.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.